Or what? You'll kick us out, the ringleader scoffed. We're paying customers, honey. Unlike some people. He nodded toward the old man. Linda straightened her shoulders. That gentleman has been nothing but polite all evening. He deserves to enjoy his meal in peace, just like everyone else. And for your information, he tipped better on a cup of coffee than you probably will on those burgers. The table fell silent, the men's faces reddening with embarrassment or anger. Linda couldn't tell which and didn't care. If you can't behave respectfully, I'll have to ask you to leave, she said firmly, surprising even herself with her resolve. You can't be serious, one sputtered. Do you know who we are? No, Linda replied simply. And it wouldn't matter if I did. In here, everyone deserves the same respect. After a tense standoff, the men threw money on the table and stormed out, hurling insults about never returning. Linda watched them leave, her heart hammering in her chest, certain she'd just cost herself a job she couldn't afford to lose. As she cleaned their table, a gentle voice spoke behind her. Thank you for that. Linda turned to find the older man standing there, his newspaper tucked under his arm. Up close, she noticed kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. It was nothing, she said, embarrassed. I'm sorry you had to hear those things. The man smiled. It wasn't nothing to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the table. Not many people would risk their job to stand up for a stranger. Linda glanced down at the card. The simple white cardstock bore only a name, phone number, and the logo of Chapman Industries, one of the largest technology companies in the country. Call that number tomorrow, the man said quietly. Tell them Howard sent you. Before Linda could respond, he placed $300 bills on the table and walked toward the exit. At the door, he turned back. There's always room in my company for people with integrity, Linda. The world has too few of them these days. As the door closed behind him, Linda stood frozen, the business card between her fingers feeling suddenly heavy with possibilities. Howard Chapman, the reclusive billionaire whose face rarely appeared in the media, had been sitting in her section all night. And she had just defended him without having any idea who he was. Linda's small apartment was quiet except for the soft whirring of her father's oxygen machine in the bedroom down the hall. She sat at her kitchen table, still in her waitress uniform, staring at the business card as if it might disappear at any moment. The $300 bills were spread out before her, more money than she usually made in tips during an entire week. Howard Chapman, she whispered to herself, the name finally clicking in her mind. She'd seen it in newspapers and heard it mentioned on TV. The man owned a tech empire worth billions, started from nothing in his garage over 40 years ago. What on earth had he been doing in a rundown diner on the edge of town? Linda rubbed her eyes, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. At 52, she felt every one of those years tonight. The apartment walls needed fresh paint, the refrigerator made concerning noises, and the stack of medical bills by the phone seemed to grow taller each week. Her father's Parkinson's medication alone cost more than she could comfortably afford, even with her second job cleaning offices on weekends. Lynn? Everything okay? Her father's voice called weakly from the bedroom. She quickly tucked the card into her pocket and gathered the money. Everything's fine, Dad. Just got home. Need anything? Just checking you got home safe, he replied, his voice trailing off into a cough. Linda filled a glass with water and took it to his room. Robert Wilson had once been a strong construction worker who could carry her on his shoulders. Now, at 78, he was frail, his hands trembling constantly as he reached for the water. You're working too hard, he said, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. I don't like it. I'm fine, Dad, she assured him, adjusting his blanket. Just a busy night. Get some rest. Back in the kitchen, Linda made herself a cup of tea and pulled out the business card again. Was this some kind of joke? Rich people sometimes got their kicks in strange ways. But something about the old man's, Mr. Chapman's, eyes had seemed genuinely kind. Sincere. Linda's mind wandered to what could have been. She'd once dreamed of becoming a nurse, had even completed 2 years of community college before her mother's illness forced her to drop out and start working full-time. That was 30 years ago. Her mother had passed away, but by then, Linda was trapped in the cycle of living paycheck to paycheck, never quite able to get ahead enough to go back to school. She thought about Jerry, her manager at the diner, and winced. He'd be furious about her confronting customers, especially ones who ordered expensive meals. She might not even have a job to return to tomorrow. The thought sent a spike of anxiety through her chest. Across town, in a penthouse overlooking the city, Howard Chapman removed his baseball cap and placed it on a marble countertop. His disguise wasn't much of one, just ordinary clothes and a cap pulled low, but it worked because people saw what they expected to see. And no one expected to see one of the richest men in America eating pie at a diner in a working-class neighborhood. "How was your excursion, sir?" asked Henderson, his longtime personal assistant, appearing silently as he always seemed to do. "Enlightening," Howard replied, settling into his favorite chair by the window. "I found what I was looking for." "Indeed, sir?" Henderson raised an eyebrow, used to his employer's cryptic statements after 3 decades of service. Howard gazed out at the city lights. "Did you know I'm turning 80 next month, Henderson?" "I've ordered the cake already, sir." Howard chuckled. 45 years building this company. "And do you know what keeps me up at night?" "Not competition. Not stock prices." He paused. "It's wondering if anyone at Chapman Industries still understands what we were built on. Real people. Integrity. Not just profit margins." Henderson nodded, having heard variations of this concern more frequently in recent years. "Those young executives from the board dinner tonight, did you see how they behaved when they thought no one important was watching?" Howard shook his head, recalling the crude businessman from the diner. "But that waitress, she had no idea who I was, yet she stood up for a stranger at risk to herself." Henderson placed a glass of water on the side table. "So tomorrow will be interesting, I take it?" "Yes," Howard said with a small smile. "Have Thomas prepare the special interview protocol. I have a feeling about this one." Back in her apartment, Linda finally made her decision. She couldn't afford not to call the number. Even if it was some elaborate prank, she had nothing to lose. Her father needed his medication, and if she'd lost her job at the diner, she needed to find something quickly. She placed the business card on her nightstand and set her alarm clock for 7 a.m. As she drifted off to sleep, she wondered what "Howard sent you" was supposed to mean to whoever answered that phone. She pictured the kind eyes behind those wire-rimmed glasses and felt, for the first time in years, a flicker of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of her mother, who had always told her that kindness would find its way back to you somehow. Linda had stopped believing that a long time ago. But maybe, just maybe, her mother had been right after all. Linda's hands trembled as she dialed the number from the business card the next morning. She had already called the diner to explain she'd be late for her shift, only to discover that Jerry had indeed been furious about the previous night's incident. Her job wasn't officially gone, but she was on thin ice, as he'd put it. The phone rang 3 times before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Chapman Industries, how may I direct your call?" Linda swallowed hard. "My name is Linda Wilson. I was told to call this number and say that Howard sent me." There was a pause, followed by a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Ms. Wilson." "Yes. We've been expecting your call." The woman's tone had changed completely. "A car will be sent to your address in 1 hour. Will that be convenient?" Linda blinked in surprise. "A car? Yes, I suppose that would be fine." She gave her address, wondering if she should mention that she lived in one of the most rundown apartment buildings in town. "Excellent. The driver will call when they arrive. Please bring identification." Before Linda could ask any questions, the line went dead. She stared at the phone, bewildered. What exactly had she gotten herself into? An hour later, dressed in her only interview outfit, a navy blue skirt and jacket she'd bought secondhand 5 years ago. Linda stood nervously by the curb. Her father had been both concerned and intrigued when she explained what had happened, making her promise to call him the moment she learned what this was all about. A sleek black car with tinted windows pulled up precisely on time. The driver, a woman in a neat uniform, opened the door for her. "Ms. Wilson? I'm Diane. I'll be taking you to Chapman Industries headquarters." The drive took nearly an hour, moving from Linda's modest neighborhood into the gleaming downtown business district. Chapman Industries headquarters dominated the skyline, a towering glass structure that seemed to touch the clouds. Linda had seen it from a distance many times but had never had any reason to go near it. "We're here," Diane announced, pulling up to a private entrance. "Someone will meet you inside." The lobby was all polished marble and soaring ceilings. Linda felt painfully out of place as her worn shoes squeaked against the floor. A young man in an impeccable suit approached her with a tablet in hand. "Ms. Wilson? I'm Thomas, Mr. Chapman's executive assistant. Welcome to Chapman Industries." He gestured toward a bank of elevators. "If you'll follow me, please." As they rode up in a private elevator, Thomas explained, "Mr. Chapman has arranged a rather unconventional interview process today. I hope you don't mind." "Interview?" Linda echoed, her confusion evident. "For what position?" Thomas smiled enigmatically. "That will depend on the outcome of today's evaluation." The elevator opened directly into a large conference room where 5 people sat around a table. None of them was Howard Chapman. They introduced themselves as members of the executive team, each asking Linda questions about her background, education, and work experience. She answered honestly, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as she described her limited qualifications. 2 years of community college studying nursing, and 30 years as a waitress, said one woman, reviewing notes. "No corporate experience at all." "I realize I'm not qualified for any position here," Linda said finally, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm not sure why Mr. Chapman suggested I come." The executives exchanged glances. "This is just the preliminary assessment," Thomas explained. "The real evaluation begins now." What followed was unlike any interview Linda had ever heard of. She was led through various departments of the company and presented with scenarios that seemed more like moral puzzles than job qualifications. In the accounting department, she was shown 2 sets of numbers and asked which one she would approve, not realizing one contained hidden unethical billing practices. She chose the honest one without hesitation. In the customer service department, she was asked to respond to an irate caller who was both wrong and abusive. She managed to be firm but respectful, never compromising her dignity or the company's policies. By lunchtime, Linda was mentally exhausted. Thomas led her to a small cafeteria and invited her to eat. As she sat down with her tray, she noticed a janitor struggling to clean up a large spill while balancing other cleaning supplies. Without thinking, Linda rose and helped the man, steadying his supplies while he mopped. They chatted briefly, the man thanking her profusely before moving on. When Linda returned to her table, she found Thomas watching her with interest. "Most candidates don't even notice the maintenance staff," he commented. "I've worked alongside people like him my whole life," Linda replied. "They're usually the ones who keep everything running." The afternoon brought more unusual tests. In one, Linda was left alone in a room with an open laptop displaying confidential company information. She promptly closed it without reading anything. In another, she was given the opportunity to take credit for someone else's work and declined. By 5 o'clock, Linda was convinced the whole day had been an elaborate waste of time. Whatever Howard Chapman had seen in her last night must have been a misunderstanding or a momentary impulse on his part. She didn't belong in this world of glass and steel. Thomas led her to one final room, a comfortable office with a view of the city. "Mr. Chapman will join you shortly," he said, leaving her alone. Linda sank into a chair, her feet throbbing. She'd call her father soon to let him know she was on her way home, back to reality, back to figuring out how to make ends meet without her diner job. The door opened quietly, and Howard Chapman walked in, no longer wearing the baseball cap and worn sweater but a simple button-down shirt and slacks. Without the disguise, she could now clearly see the face that occasionally appeared in the news, older, certainly, but with the same kind eyes she'd noticed last night. "Linda," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming today. I've heard some very interesting reports about your performance." She shook his hand, too tired for pretense. "Mr. Chapman, with all due respect, I don't understand what today was about. I'm not qualified for any job here." Howard smiled, taking a seat across from her. "Actually, the reports suggest you're qualified for the exact position I had in mind. But before we discuss that, I'd like to tell you why meeting you last night mattered so much to me." Howard Chapman gazed out the window for a moment before turning back to Linda. 45 years ago, I was working as a repair technician in a small computer shop. I had ideas, big ones, but no money, no connections, and no fancy education." He smiled slightly. "What I did have was a landlady who believed in me." He walked to a shelf and picked up a framed photograph of an elderly woman with a warm smile. "Mrs. Gallagher. She owned the building where I rented a tiny apartment and the garage where I started tinkering with my first inventions. When I couldn't make rent one month because I'd spent everything on parts, instead of evicting me, she brought me dinner." Howard placed the photo back carefully. "More importantly, when a wealthy investor came looking for me and treated her dismissively, much like those men did to me last night, she refused to tell him where I was. She said anyone who couldn't treat ordinary people with respect didn't deserve to do business with her tenant." Linda listened, still unsure where this story was leading. "That investor eventually found me anyway, through a friend. But before I would sign anything, I asked him to apologize to Mrs. Gallagher. He thought I was crazy." Howard chuckled. "He apologized though, rather grudgingly. And I took his investment, with the condition that treating people with dignity would be a core value of my company." He folded his hands together. "For many years, it was. But lately, I've watched that principle erode. The young executives, like those men at the diner, they see the world differently. They value status, wealth, connections. They judge people by their usefulness." His expression hardened. "I was testing them last night. They failed spectacularly." Linda shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, but what does this have to do with me? I appreciate you sharing your story, but—" "I'm getting old, Linda," Howard interrupted gently. "I need to ensure Chapman Industries doesn't lose its soul after I'm gone. I need people who understand the value of human dignity to help steer this company." He leaned forward. "People exactly like you." Linda blinked. "Mr. Chapman, I'm a waitress. I know nothing about running a business, let alone a multinational corporation." "You know more than you think," he countered. "You've been managing people and solving problems your entire career. And more importantly, you have the one quality that can't be taught, integrity." He slid a folder across the desk to her. "This is my offer. I want you to join my executive advisory team as Director of Corporate Culture and Ethics. Your job would be to help ensure this company never forgets that every employee, every customer, every person we interact with deserves respect." Linda opened the folder and nearly gasped when she saw the salary figure. It was more money than she had made in the past 5 years combined. "This can't be real," she whispered. "The position comes with full benefits, including comprehensive health care that would cover your father's medical needs," Howard continued, as if reading her mind. "There would be a 6-month training period where you'd learn about each department in the company. You'd report directly to me." Linda closed the folder, her hands trembling. "How could you possibly know I'm right for this? You met me once, for barely an hour." Howard smiled. "I've made billion-dollar decisions on less information. Besides, today's evaluation confirmed what I already suspected. Every test we put you through, you responded with the same integrity you showed last night." "Those were tests?" Linda thought back to the janitor struggling with his supplies, the confidential information left visible, all the scenarios she'd encountered throughout the day. Every moment, Howard confirmed. And you passed them all naturally, without calculation. That's exactly what I need. Linda hesitated, the whole situation feeling surreal. Part of her wanted to accept immediately, the part that worried about her father's medical bills and their precarious financial situation. But another part, the cautious side that had been disappointed too many times, held back. Why me? She asked finally. Surely there are thousands of qualified people who also have integrity. People with the right education and experience. Howard leaned back in his chair. There's something Mrs. Gallagher told me that I've never forgotten. She said, Howard, someday when you're successful, remember that the true measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching, but what they do when they think no one is. He fixed Linda with a steady gaze. Last night, when you thought no one important was watching, you showed extraordinary character. For a long moment, Linda said nothing, turning the offer over in her mind. The salary would change her life entirely. Her father could get the best medical care available. She could finally escape the exhausting cycle of living paycheck to paycheck. But beyond the money, there was something compelling about having meaningful work, about the possibility of making a real difference. Still, doubt crept in. What if she failed? What if this was too good to be true? What if Howard Chapman changed his mind once he realized how out of place she was in his world? I sense you're hesitating, Howard observed. That's wise. I'd be concerned if you didn't approach such a significant change with caution. Linda met his eyes. It's just, people like me don't get opportunities like this. Things like this don't happen in real life. Howard's expression softened. They happen rarely, I'll grant you that. But they do happen. I'm living proof. He stood and walked to the window again. 45 years ago, I was a nobody with big dreams and empty pockets. One person who saw something in me changed everything. He turned back to her. Perhaps it's time I paid that forward. As the setting sun cast a golden glow across the office, Linda found herself at a crossroads. Behind her lay the familiar, hard work, constant struggle, and the quiet dignity of making do with less. Ahead lay the unknown, opportunity, risk, and the possibility of transformation. I don't need your answer today, Howard said gently. Take the weekend to think about it. Talk to your father. The offer will still be here on Monday. Thomas appeared at the door, ready to escort her back to the waiting car. As Linda stood to leave, Howard added one final thought. Whatever you decide, Linda, thank you for reminding an old man that the values this company was built on still matter. In a world where people are increasingly judged by their status or wealth, you judged only by character. That alone makes you extraordinary. The car ride home felt like moving between worlds. Linda clutched the folder containing the offer, wondering if she would wake up tomorrow to discover this had all been an elaborate dream. As city skyscrapers gave way to familiar neighborhood streets, the reality of her situation began to sink in. A life-changing opportunity had just landed in her lap, challenging everything she thought she knew about how the world worked. All because she had stood up for a stranger in a diner, never expecting anything in return. 5 years had passed since that life-altering night at the diner. Linda stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office on the 42nd floor of Chapman Industries headquarters, watching the city come alive in the early morning light. At 57, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from navigating challenges far different from those she'd known as a waitress. The transition hadn't been easy. Her first few months as director of corporate culture and ethics had been filled with skepticism from other executives, whispered comments about her background, and her own crippling self-doubt. There were nights she'd gone home to the new apartment she shared with her father and cried, convinced she was in over her head. But Howard had been right about one thing, she did no more than she thought. Decades of handling difficult customers, managing tense situations, and observing human behavior had given her insights that no business degree could provide. She saw patterns that others missed, recognized when policies looked good on paper but failed in practice, and never forgot what it was like to be the person at the bottom of the corporate ladder. "Morning, Linda," called a friendly voice. Tanya, her assistant, placed a coffee on her desk. "Mr. Chapman asked if you could join the board meeting at 10. They're finalizing the new factory location today." Linda nodded, grateful for the reminder. "How's your son's new job working out?" Tanya beamed. "Loving it. That apprenticeship program you started is giving him a real chance, especially since college wasn't his thing." After Tanya left, Linda sat at her desk and opened a folder containing the proposals for the new manufacturing facility. Chapman Industries had narrowed the location down to two options, one in a wealthy suburb that offered substantial tax breaks, and another in a struggling former industrial town that needed the jobs desperately. The numbers favored the suburb. The ethics committee she'd assembled leaned toward the struggling town. Today's meeting would make the final decision, and Linda knew her voice would carry significant weight. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. At 83, Robert Wilson was doing remarkably well, his Parkinson's managed with top-notch medical care that would have been impossible on a waitress's salary. His message was a photo of him with his physical therapist, giving a thumbs up after mastering a new exercise. Linda smiled, thinking of how much had changed. Their spacious apartment near a park, the worry-free medical care, the ability to send money to her cousin's family when they faced a crisis, all of it still felt like a dream sometimes. A notification on her computer reminded her of an appointment that afternoon, a meeting with a potential candidate for the company's mentorship program. Howard had expanded the initiative based on Linda's suggestion, creating opportunities for promising individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. As she gathered her materials for the board meeting, Linda's mind drifted back to that pivotal weekend 5 years ago, when she'd sat in her old apartment with the job offer in her hands, torn between fear and hope. She had called her oldest friend, Betty, who'd listened in amazement to the story and then said simply, "Girl, if you don't take this chance, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Her father had been more practical. "What's the worst that could happen? You try it, it doesn't work out, and you go back to waiting tables. But what if it does work out?" Monday morning, she had returned to Chapman Industries and accepted the position, her voice steadier than she felt. Howard's face had lit up with genuine pleasure, as if her acceptance was a personal victory for him. Now, 5 years later, she understood why. The company had indeed been losing its way, prioritizing profit margins over people. With Howard's backing and her unique perspective, Linda had implemented changes that restored the balance, from revised customer service protocols to a complete overhaul of employee benefits and workplace conditions. The elevator chimed as it reached the executive floor, interrupting her memories. As she stepped out, she nodded to several employees passing by, all of whom greeted her by name. In the beginning, she'd worried about fitting in among people with prestigious degrees and tailored suits. Now she understood that respect came not from appearances but from actions and results. "Linda." Howard's voice called from down the hallway. At 85, he moved more slowly these days but remained sharp as ever. "Just the person I wanted to see before the meeting." They walked together to his office, discussing the factory location decision. As they talked, Linda noticed the framed photograph on Howard's desk, not Mrs. Gallagher this time, but a new addition. It showed Howard and Linda at the company's 40th anniversary gala, both laughing at something off camera. "I've been thinking," Howard said as they concluded their discussion. "It's time we made some changes to the succession plan." Linda raised an eyebrow. Howard had been gradually stepping back from day-to-day operations, though he remained chairman of the board. "What kind of changes?" "I want to nominate you for the position of Chief Operations Officer," he said simply. Linda stared at him in shock. "Howard, that's exactly the right move," he finished for her. "The board already respects you. The employees trust you. You've proven yourself 10 times over. There are others with more experience, more education." Howard waved away her objections. 5 years ago, you questioned why I would offer a waitress an executive position. I took a chance on character over credentials then, and I've never regretted it for a moment." Before she could respond, his intercom buzzed. The board members were assembling. Think about it, Howard said as they walked to the meeting. Though I suspect I already know your answer. As they entered the boardroom, Linda looked around at the faces that had become familiar over the years. Some had been skeptical of her at first, now they valued her input and perspective. She had earned her place at this table. The discussion about the factory location began, with presentations of financial projections and logistical considerations. When it was Linda's turn to speak, she stood confidently. The numbers favor Westfield, she acknowledged, referencing the wealthy suburb. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Riverdale has an experienced manufacturing workforce desperate for opportunity. Their proposal includes community partnership initiatives that align perfectly with our corporate values. She paused, meeting each board member's eyes. 5 years ago, Howard reminded us that this company was built on seeing potential where others didn't. On valuing people as people, not just as assets or liabilities on a spreadsheet. I believe Riverdale gives us the chance to honor that legacy. When the vote came, Riverdale won by a significant margin. As the meeting concluded, several board members approached Linda to express their support for Howard's COO nomination. Later that afternoon, Linda sat across from a nervous young woman in the company cafeteria. Delia was 24, a single mother working 3 part-time jobs while taking night classes. Her community college counselor had recommended her for Chapman's mentorship program. I don't have much experience in business, Delia admitted, echoing words Linda had spoken herself years earlier. Tell me about your current jobs, Linda prompted gently. As Delia described juggling her responsibilities, her eyes lit up when she talked about organizing a childcare cooperative among her fellow students, creating a schedule that accommodated everyone's classes and work. Linda recognized something in the young woman, the same resourcefulness and integrity that had once caught Howard's attention in a tired waitress. Delia, Linda said when she finished, I think you have exactly the kind of experience we value here. The young woman's expression of surprise and cautious hope was so familiar it brought a lump to Linda's throat. That evening, as Linda drove home, she thought about the full circle her life had taken. From serving coffee to helping shape a billion-dollar company's future. From struggling to pay bills to preparing to become COO. From being judged by her job title to being valued for her character. Her father was watching a baseball game when she arrived home. Good day, he asked, muting the TV. Linda smiled, thinking of Howard's nomination, the Riverdale decision, and Delia's face when she learned she'd been accepted into the mentorship program. A very good day, she replied, sitting beside him. You know, Dad, Mom used to say that kindness finds its way back to you eventually. He nodded, his eyes crinkling with memory. She was right about that. Life has a way of balancing things out in the end. As the evening settled around them, Linda felt a deep sense of gratitude. 5 years ago, she had stood up for an elderly stranger in a diner, never expecting anything in return. That simple act of decency had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined. But more importantly, it had given her the chance to create the same opportunity for others, to recognize worth in unexpected places, to value character over credentials, and to remember that sometimes, the most important qualifications can't be listed on a resume. Howard had been right. The true measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone is watching, but what they do when they think no one is. Linda Wilson had passed that test without knowing she was taking it. Now, as the new chapter of her life began, she was determined to ensure that Chapman Industries would always remain a place where such values mattered, where kindness, integrity, and respect would continue to find their way back to those who needed them most. The diner's night shift dragged on as Linda wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time. Her feet ached in worn-out sneakers, and the weight of a double shift pressed down on her shoulders. 30 years of waiting tables had taught her to spot trouble the moment it walked through the door, and tonight, trouble wore expensive suits and loud voices. 3 businessmen in tailored suits barged in at 11 p.m., already half-drunk and full of themselves. They slid into a corner booth, laughing too loudly and snapping their fingers for service. In the opposite corner sat an elderly man in a plain sweater and worn baseball cap, quietly reading a newspaper while nursing a cup of coffee. He'd been there for over an hour, ordering only coffee and a slice of apple pie, leaving a $5 tip on a $7 order. "Hey, waitress. Some service over here," called the loudest of the businessmen, not bothering to look up from his phone. Linda plastered on her customer service smile and approached their table. "Welcome to Rosie's. What can I get for you gentlemen tonight?" The men ordered expensive steaks not on the menu, then settled for burgers with complicated modifications. As Linda turned to place their order, one of them grabbed her wrist. "And sweetheart, maybe smile a little more for us? Might help with the tip," he said with a wink that made her skin crawl. Linda gently pulled her arm away. "I'll get those orders in for you right away," she said, maintaining her professional tone despite the burning in her cheeks. As she moved between tables, she noticed the businessmen growing increasingly rowdy, their voices carrying throughout the small diner. They began commenting on other customers, particularly the quiet older man in the corner. "Look at that old-timer," one snickered. "Probably counting pennies to pay for that coffee. Bet he's been nursing that same cup all night," another added. "Pathetic." Linda watched the older man shrink slightly in his seat, though his expression remained neutral as he turned a page in his newspaper. Something about his dignity in the face of their rudeness struck her. When the businessmen's food arrived, one immediately complained. "This isn't medium rare. This is practically mooing." "And where's the extra sauce I asked for?" Linda apologized and offered to take it back to the kitchen, but the man waved her off dismissively. "Just forget it. I expect this kind of service in a dump like this." That's when Linda noticed one of the men pointing at the older gentleman and making a cruel joke about his Goodwill clothes. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he folded his newspaper. Something snapped inside Linda. 30 years of biting her tongue suddenly felt too long. She approached the businessman's table, her customer service smile gone. "Gentlemen, I need to ask you to lower your voices and show respect to our other customers." The men looked at her in surprise, then burst out laughing.